it invites a different set of histories. So my immediate sort of set of questions is, in addition to the histories of wars that the United States has waged, in Asia, what is the history of the sexual economy of violence in the South, right? That is a very different history that's introduced. And by virtue of this event taking place in the South, it absolutely should inform our response and the way that we think about moving forward in terms of Asian American and African American Black organizations being able to, again, pursue a much more radical abolitionist response.
Well, let me ask you this, Sora, and I'll ask this to all the panel. Does this shooting make us shine a brighter light maybe on sex work? Because one thing about the shooting, and I shared the video, I know I shared it with Paul either early this morning or late last night, and I think I shared it with you guys. I don't know if you guys saw it. There was a woman on Democracy Now! That was trying to describe the conditions in which these women, some of them that got killed in, were living inside of the massage parlor, and at a certain point, like, stopped short of saying they're slave-like conditions, because these people were living inside here and had to work there for God knows how much money. It was pretty horrible conditions, but those were conditions that were brought on them by people that looked like them.
This is a very important thing you bring up here, Jason, because one of the things that seems to be lacking, and by the way, this again, we realize that this happens in the way America covers all communities, but even in the Black community, right? That there's this assumption that there's one particular class of individuals, usually an elite class, that represents the collective interest of everyone else. I don't see any attempt to complicate this Asian narrative within the class hierarchy with internally Asian society, that like these people were, the women who were killed were obviously clearly poor. They don't fulfill that kind of that model minority mythology. How is that resonating internally in terms of how they're being viewed, not only by the media, but within the Asian community? And why is there discussion in terms of how internal class hierarchy within the Asian community helps facilitate the type of exploitation we see of these workers? I think it's a very important point. And of course, as people who are somewhat on the left, I don't think we can expect mainstream corporate media to make these kind of analyses, but I frankly haven't seen anyone interrogate this particular event from that perspective. And I'd love to hear some thoughts on that.
Go for it.
Should I?
Well, I mean, we brought you here for a reason, huh?
Well, let me just say, I really am sort of weighing in as a researcher, who's really, kind of immersed myself in the study of the history of American law. And so I guess I hesitate sort of making any kind of prescriptions to activist organizations. And my thoughts really are sort of engaging with what are the key terms that are emerging in the response, right? And how do those terms either narrow or widen the scope of political possibility? And there, correct me if I'm wrong, Pascal, but there really hasn't been a discussion of the model minority. I mean, and this is the reason why, when there was that statement circulated, I can't remember the name of the organization that circulated, how, critical race theory, this particular sort of genre of knowledge from within legal studies about the history of race and racism in American law is anti-Asian, right? That is a sort of a way in which we could register the model minority. So these are organizations that would really sort of embody and take on the model model minority status and say, hey, look, we did it. Why can't everybody else?
Mm-hmm.
And that definitely is leverage against the kinds of organizations that have been stepping up to, advance issues of gender equality and sex workers' rights, et cetera, et cetera. So that internal class differentiation is very, very important. I think it manifests in the response around the shooting in the sense that we don't hear too much of the kind of Asian American organizations who really defend the model minority myth weighing in. But I think we will actually see more of it, and how it will actually play into the discussion. It will, I don't want to sort of make predictions, but the forms of historical events that are being referenced, there's the Vincent Chin assault in Detroit that I think many of our audience know about. He was attacked by two white men who, were angry about, at the time, the sort of deindustrialization we saw in American automaking, and attacked Vincent Chin. And that is sort of entering into our political discourse, as well as the kind of surveillance and the construction of the foreigner in a specific sector of Asian immigrant sort of migration to the United States. And those are the kind of much more professional, sort of bourgeois, capitalized sectors of immigrant communities, Asian immigrant communities. And so we're gonna start to see an occasion for us to have to reassert that if we're going to articulate a radical racial politics stemming from these recent events of anti-Asian hate, then it needs to actually start with and center, women like those who were killed a few days ago. And where the question is, where do we get that class perspective? What kinds of resources and histories do we draw to get that kind of class perspective? I would say that, that's where the relation between Asian American organizations and African American organizations is crucial. Because if we've seen anything from this long history of racism in the United States, it's Black radicalism that has really sort of created the space and held a space open for that class perspective that you're talking about.
Well, let me ask you and I'm always asking everybody this question. But so do you think there's a bit of the race pimps are coming out at this point? Like, are you thinking that, Pascal, that what we're seeing right here?
You mean like the Asian version of our race pimps, or our own traditional race pimps?
Yeah, is there Al Sharpton? Is there?
I'm asking the question. I don't know. I'm asking. I'm not saying.
This is a very good question. No, Jason, that's not an insignificant question, right? Because we've talked ad nauseum on this show. I don't think when we talk about it consistently about how the leadership apparatus within the Black community is a class manifestation of a tier, or the Black political class, or Black misleadership class, or whatever you want to call them, basically being in third world studies they would call compradors, or in other words, they are functionaries of the ruling class who use racial unity as an illusion to cover their role as basically implementing an agenda of the ruling class under the charade of Black unity. So the question becomes, and this is a long-standing, as we had Preston Smith on the show talk about how this is a long-standing reality that has existed in the African-American kind of political paradigm. The question becomes, right, is that, does this exist in the Asian community? Is there an Asian political class? Now, I am not cognizant of, I don't know. I don't believe that there is an Al Sharpton for the Asian community or a Jesse Jackson for the Asian community.
No.
And I think that part of the reason
Yang wants to take that mantle on.
I think part of the reason why we have not traditionally seen that, right, is that the perception, and the key word is perception, is that the Asians are doing well. They're kicking off. You know what I'm saying? They don't have all these other problems. As a matter of fact, let's be very blunt. When we do in the recently, when we have seen conversations with the Asian community around political events outside of these racial antagonisms, they've been about things like challenging affirmative action, questioning the relationship between Asians and merit and hierarchy in universities, which have been antagonistic to things that have been very important to the African American community. And there is, and I've seen this, a kind of belief that these people don't need help. They are the community they are the ascended community. I see people posting charts about wealth gap. Look at the Asian white wealth. They got more money than white people. You know what I'm saying? Why do they need our help? So there are all of these kind of complicated perceptions about, the Asian community vis-a-vis other, oppressed communities of color, if you will. And I would like to know, is there a burgeoning leadership strata in the Asian community that exists similar to the Black political class, if you will?
Paul, did you want to jump in? You look like you want to say something.
Yeah, well, it's not a direct response to that question. I can wait.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, to the earlier question of like, where can the class perspective come from? And this is a big problem I'm seeing, and it's not unique to Asian Americans. This is for everyone, that about the NGOization or the non-profitization, whatever you want to call it, of politics. And like, our political institutions and organizations are hollowed out, and they're being replaced by these nonprofits and NGOs that are never going to really center the class narrative. And that's the issue. I mean, think back to the civil rights movement. The main organizations that were carrying that forward were mass membership, dues-paying organizations. I mean, for one, the labor movement was crucial, but organizations, and not that these are perfect groups, but NAACP, SNCC, CORE, even Black Panther Party. These are actual real political organizations where you're paying dues, you are a member. Even the Democratic Party, which is not a real party in that sense, but where politics was happening, has also been hollowed out. And I think that really is where you're going to get the true class perspective, because these are organizations that come from a class and are, ostensibly maintained by that class financially and organizationally. So, and that's why I don't think automatically the idea is like, well, if they're working with the existing Black organizations, and I think we might talk about this later with Black Lives Matter, but you see the same problem coming up. They're attempting to do this through a hodgepodge of nonprofits. And I don't think when we have made progress, it has been done that way. I think we need other political institutions that have been hollowed out over so long. I think that's where you will get the class perspective. I just don't really expect it from the existing like constellation of 10 million nonprofits doing 10 million things, if that makes sense.
I think last night we called it the NGO. We called it the NGO industrial complex.
Yeah, the nonprofit
right.
industrial complex.
And this is something like, it really keeps me up at night. It's become the new common sense of like, and I'm not trying to say if you work for a nonprofit, you're a bad person, like very well-meaning people, but the tools that we once had to really get the things we want to get done, it's not that they're not there anymore, but they've been hollowed out, and it's just common sense of like, oh, you got to do a nonprofit. That's how you make change. That's how you're a thought leader. It's really bad. It's just a bad culture of political activism that we can't go that route. It's just not going to come from that route. It never has. Again, I think the civil rights movement is a great example of that. The labor movement, when we've seen these reforms, you can't like short circuit or shortcut that process.
Marcus,
I think that what Paul's saying is like exactly kind of on the head. And when I think, and as I was saying on the pre-show, like it was like kind of the first thing that I thought was, I no longer want to try and do this zoom in on this specific incident, this tragic fucking series of murders, to try and, extrapolate, this is what we need to do next, right? I think it's better just understand that there's a lot of narratives at play, but there's a few that we can understand that absolutely need to be taken apart, and I think Sword hit on it before, where how are we looking at the history of the United States military and foreign policy, and how do those structures now play into how people immigrate to this country and how do they fit into our society, and then going further into how do people empower themselves. And, want to mirror what Paul's saying. Hey, if you work in a nonprofit, like, they're not saying you're a bad person or anything like that. Like, but honestly, we live in a capitalist society. So almost everywhere that we work, as the proverbial we, is engaging in some sort of exploitation in one way or another, right? If you're just even participating as the exploitee. And so, yes, like, and that's where I think the actual effort, needs to be done, is organizing in a way that dismantles the military industrial complex, because this is the stuff that I see every day, is almost, easily every day. There's multiple articles in the defense and national security sphere that are directly geared at provoking a war with China. And how do these things play into roles and how people are viewed in society? And then just on the basic, if people's material conditions are not met because we live in a society that generally oppresses almost all of the working class, people are going to end up in situations where they have to live in this massage parlor, and engage in labor that they probably wouldn't
in their twilight years. Let's also add that these people are in their twilight years. These aren't spring chickens, these are older women.
Something that, like, it was really hitting me is that for one of these ladies, and her son had spoken out and saying that she used to be a teacher in Korea, and coming here, and this is all the work she was able to find, and but this is a lady in their fit. Most of these women were old enough to be this dude's mom or grandmother. So there's a lot of things I think that are just like screaming out from this incident, but I don't think looking at it as a catalyst to some different action that we need to do, is a good way to think about it. I think, zooming out, understanding that, there's multiple structures at play here. And, kind of what Paul was alluding to is that building organizations that actually can tackle the bigger, problems is probably a more useful.
To hear the rest of this show and more, you can find us at This Is Revolution Podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Podbean, Pandora, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, you can find a new episode every Wednesday on the Zero Books YouTube channel. This is Revolution.